The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia, Turkey, has deemed it the oldest known megalithic site in the world by mainstream science. Since it was unearthed by Dr. Klaus Schmidt in 1996, Göbekli Tepe's circular temples have forever changed the way archaeologists look at the beginnings of civilization, and in more ways than one. In 1997, an expert on cereals, Professor Manfred Hune at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, started investigating an area close to Göbekli Tepe for evidence that would lead him to the first grains. His discovery of einkorn, an ancient single-grain wheat, took him 20 miles northwest to the mountain of Karadag, the same mountain Anton Parks was able to trace the Sumerian version of the Garden of Eden. Hune believes this grain was the first cereal and older than any other grain known to man. The extensive lab results proved that the specimens of einkorn and emmer wheat dated back to 10,500 years ago. An article boasting his work stated, just as the dog evolved from the wolf and pigs evolved from boars, our cereals have been significantly altered by human civilization. But what if humans were altered by the cereals they ate as well?
The area of Turkey called Anatolia plays a huge role in the human story. As far as we know, that's where the first indications of organized agriculture appear. And they appear around about 11,600 years ago. Why these things should have happened in Anatolia rather than somewhere else isn't really a question I can absolutely answer, except to say that perhaps the land was conducive to what needed to be done there. We're to envisage a group of hunter-gatherers who wake up one morning equipped with all the skills necessary to create what does turn out to be the largest megalithic site on Earth. Where did those skills develop? The only thing that archaeologists can do to explain this is kind of suggest that that must have been a specially gifted group of hunter-gatherers. They kind of gloss over the fact that we can't see any evidence of the evolution or development of these skills. Their only explanation can be that somehow a group of hunter-gatherers, even though we see no evidence of them practicing or learning how to do this, they must have woken up one morning just magically equipped with the ability to create this extraordinary, astronomically aligned, gigantic megalithic site. And just as by a sort of an afterthought, they also invented agriculture at the same time. That, believe it or not, is what we are being taught about Göbekli Tepe now.
It is interesting to point out that not very far from the Karadag site that I located, we find the city of Göbekli Tepe. It is indeed intriguing. And also something else similar. In Sumerian texts, you can find an important character, the goddess Nisaba. She is the goddess of agriculture, of writing, and of wisdom. Nisaba, the goddess of rations and wheat. Indeed, she can also be called Demeter in Greek. In general, she is considered to be one of Enki's daughters.
Was there really a goddess of wheat and of agriculture? And if so, did this goddess teach the hunter-gatherers the skills of farming? Graham points out that this might be more evidence of what he calls an outreach program.
Now, how are we to take all of this, and how can we put it into some kind of context? For me, what I think we're looking at is more evidence that there was a high civilization that we have lost track of. We have forgotten a very important part of our story. And fragments of that story crop up all around the world. What I think we're looking at is an outreach program reaching out to the hunter-gatherers in what we would call the Upper Paleolithic, and beginning to teach certain of them selected skills, giving them the gifts of civilization. I think what happened in Anatolia was that the survivors of a lost civilization wiped out during the cataclysmic episode that immediately preceded 11,600 years ago, chose Anatolia as one of the places where they would settle and attempt to rebuild or recreate what had been lost.
We have evidence that there were advanced civilization, there was advanced civilization or civilizations, advanced sophisticated cultures that arose before the end of the last ice age. So we can think in round terms of about 10,000 BC. There was a natural catastrophe that occurred at 9700 BC, snapped us out of the ice age. And what I've determined and piecing the evidence together is that what caused it at 9700 BC was a major solar outburst. People can think of solar flares, but much larger than anything we've ever seen or experienced in modern times. What's known as coronal mass ejections. In some cases, what would have looked like huge lightning bolts literally hit the surface of the Earth, melted glaciers virtually instantaneously. This released pressure set off earthquake activity, set off volcanic activity. And actually, in the present day, we now know that volcanic and earthquake activity correlates with solar activity, even in the present day. But when you had a massive solar outburst like this, it would have been order of magnitudes larger.
Did these ancient peoples survive a cataclysm so great that they started to rebuild a new society near the most important ancient monument at the time? A society that required a new kind of food.
The earliest evidence we have of cultivated grain is in southern Turkey near the Syrian border. Now, there were grains before that, but this is the cultivation of grains, which means it's a slightly different kind of grain, or something evolved or changed, something new about the grain that allowed it to be planted, that allowed people to settle and not be nomads. So civilization is to be dated from that one development, that one event. It's all about grain.
Is it possible that the agricultural revolution began near Göbekli Tepe because humans wanted to stay near the site, and to do so, they needed to feed the people that migrated to this ancient spot after a cataclysm? Could the old ways of gathering of wild wheat to eat have not been enough for such a population in one area? But how then could the cultivation of an intense amount of crops begin? Corey Good suggests that there might have been an intervention.
There was a great cataclysm that pretty much separated humanity, and the pre-Adamites were leading humanity at that time. Most of the pre-Adamites died in the cataclysm. The ones who did not die were spread out across the earth, and they began to reestablish civilization and bring humanity together and teach them animal husbandry and how to grow crops. Not just the grains, but a lot of corn. A lot of the different things that we harvest were genetically engineered by the non-terrestrial groups. They were brought here from another planet and genetically spliced with native plants. The reason we know this is that when you look back in the historical record, looking at fossils, you don't see these genetically engineered wheats or grasses. You only see the wild grasses. These crops seem to appear here out of the blue in the historical record. Historians have located ancient grains in Anatolia, Turkey. What are the chances that these grains are going to have their birthplace in the same place that humanity did?
Could the ancients have genetically altered the grasses of Earth? And if so, how did that modify the human DNA?
Food, as it pertains to our DNA structure, can literally be traced back to what we would call an interaction with what some people call the Anunnaki, with this non-human intelligence. Now, there was a goddess, and she was apparently a geneticist when you read these ancient Sumerian tablets. And it's at this time of interaction that pretty much every cereal grain appears on the earth. Before that, we just had nothing. We can't trace them past a certain point. And what's interesting is it's at this stage that ancient civilization just explodes. As soon as these cereal grains begin to appear, all of these ancient civilizations begin to appear. At first there was nothing, then all of a sudden we have civilization after civilization that have mathematics, culture, they're building monuments, they're performing agricultural feats. I believe that all of that can be equated to the introduction of these cereal grains into our DNA, because she was actually affecting human DNA at that time through a number of different experiments. And a lot of this might be where the Babylonian bloodlines are originated from.
Could the bloodlines, or elite, have been created as a result of the cultivation of wheat? If this is true, is it possible that this was the first hierarchy created within the human population between those that cultivate the land and those who benefit from it? If humans could not roam anymore for their food in the wild as they had done as hunter-gatherers, then did these humans fall into a system that would make them dependent on the cultivation of food to survive? Could evidence lead us back to the Garden of Eden?
We seem to trace everything back to this Garden of Eden as the cradle of civilization as well. And it appears that it is not the cradle of civilization, it is the cradle of re-civilization. A civilization prior had fallen, and afterwards, after a cataclysm, they then had to rebuild, and that is where they began.
But the idea of the Garden of Eden essentially is a metaphor for bringing and restoring order to the face of the earth. Now, that works on one level. On the other level, you can also establish a physical Garden of Eden where you have animal husbandry, you have the growth of cereal crop, structures which are now coherent. So all of these things are built up into a kind of an orderly environment, which by its nature, by people actually interacting with this orderly environment, they themselves rise from a state of barbarism into a state of order and perfection. And the people that kind of came up with this concept appear to have been people who are human or human-like, but somehow different. And they often are described as being very tall. They certainly knew about how to domesticate cattle and crops. So they obviously came from some kind of a godly caste. And but back then, you have to understand that gods were not necessarily people. Gods were forces of nature. But they were people who also personified those forces of nature. So they had the understanding, they had the processes of ancient knowledge, which goes back thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And they tried to impose that on the actual land to bring humanity back into a state of order from this terrible catastrophe. They understood how nature works, the dynamics of the systems of the universe. So they became as gods. And this is where we get that sort of overlap of thinking that these people were themselves gods. They were actually godlike.
Could these godlike beings be the characters in the Sumerian text? Is it possible that these beings could be the elite the ancient texts talk about that bring cultivation to the human race? According to Jack Carey's research, a battle for humanity takes place between these gods, and the seeds are the only thing that will help the human population continue.